So we've talked about a lot of different pieces of how to read poetry. One of the ones that's come up a few times is pacing. So let's go ahead and discuss that one now, as well as look at some examples of pacing and how you can change it. So pacing is the speed at which a particular piece of poetry is read. And as we talked about feet and meter, we discussed how that affects pacing, but that's just a small part of it. As was mentioned in that one, understanding the feet and meter of a particular piece of poetry affects the rhythm at which we might read it, but it's not the entire thing. There's more that goes into it than just that. So pacing is also determined by the emotional content of a poem. Fast speeds are often correlated with emotions like anger, excitement, fear, which is different than dread. So really sharp, strong emotions, the idea of falling head over heels in love and being pumped up and excited and limerent. When we have a poem like that, it's generally intended to be read quick to mimic how we feel inside when you are experiencing those. By contrast, if we give a slow piece of poetry, it's usually correlated with contemplation, sadness, or love, especially long-term love or the loss of a love, something like that. So if we can understand what our poem is about, that also changes the way in which we might read it. It affects the pacing. Pacing you can also change in response to mimicking a phenomenon, like Edgar Allan Poe's The Raven, as we've talked about a few times before. The Raven speeds up as you read it, which kind of mimics the feeling of the heartbeat going faster and that spike of fear and adrenaline as it really kind of courses through you. So if you want to affect pacing, you need to understand the way that phonics and sound affects them. So for instance, if you have a bunch of short words in sequence, you can speed up the pacing. You can also do this with alliteration. You can do this with rhyme. You can do it with assonance. We talked about the repetition and how sharp sounds like the stops, T's, K's, things like that can change the speed at which you read. So if you have something that's really soft and smooth, it's going to change how fast you can read it as opposed to needing to stop all of the time. So an example that we'll look at is in Mac Lethal's song, Look at Me Now. So he has this song, battling anybody with a better view ahead of you. That's one of the lines, and it's really easy in the way that it rolls off the tongue. Battling anybody with a better view ahead of you. So you can hear that those repetition sounds, that you, and then the T's give that really quick feeling to it. It's kind of hard to read that line slow because you just want to slide on through it. And somebody who's really, really good at writing and rhymes knows how to do that using internal rhymes and things like that, can really get that feeling to try to match the beat that they're going for. You can do it the other way too. You can really slow things down by not repeating a bunch of sounds, by having a bunch of sounds that stand independently. And if we go back to our memory of scansion, by changing the way that syllables are expressed in a particular piece, those stressed versus unstressed syllables, they can cause you to really slow down at reading. So for instance, long words and words that have mismatched feet, those can slow us down, like in the term yellow Lamborghini. That one's a little bit tougher to say fast. You can't do that with the same speed. Battling anybody with a better view ahead of you, yellow Lamborghini. So it took me, even though that top line was way longer, I was able to read it much, much faster than that yellow Lamborghini line. And you can do this with a whole bunch of other things as well. So if we look at the fifth point down, just saying this out loud, you can try to say it as quickly as you can, but because there's not a lot of repetition of sound, it's going to slow down. There's only so fast you can articulate it. Pacing can also change in response to mimicking a phenomenon such as Edgar Allan Poe's The Raven. So there's not a whole lot of repeated sounds in there, and it kind of takes you all over on a linguistic journey, which makes it really, really hard to read that quickly. So if I wanted to do something that was about loss and sadness and I really wanted to slow it down, I would try to avoid doing a whole bunch of repeated sounds that would speed it up. So we are going to stop talking about pacing here because it is much better for us to look at an example of pacing and see how that one can be expressed best. I wandered lonely as a cloud by William Wordsworth. Even the title is hard to read quickly. I wandered lonely as a cloud, which makes sense because this is a whole poem about a dream that he had, where he talks about flying and floating through the air, as you often do when you have dreams of flight. So let's read this one and let's see how he has used language to really slow it down and give it a very fuzzy, flowy, dream-like feeling. This is one that if you read it quickly, if you're able to even read it quickly, then you're really going to lose a lot of the meaning and the importance of this one. I wandered, lonely as a cloud that floats on high o'er vales and hills, when all at once I saw a crowd, a host of golden daffodils, beside the lake, beneath the trees, fluttering and dancing in the breeze, continuous as the stars that shine and twinkle on the Milky Way. They stretched in never-ending line along the margin of a bay. 10,000 I saw at a glance, tossing their head in sprightly dance. The waves beside them danced, but they outdid the sparkling waves in glee. A poet could not but be gay in such a jocund company. I gazed and gazed, but little thought what wealth the show to me had brought. For oft when on my couch I lie, in vacant or in pensive mood, they flash upon that inward eye, which is the bliss of solitude. And then my heart with pleasure fills and dances with the daffodils. So that's a good one because you can really hear the rhythm that it's going. It's very flowy and dreamlike. I wandered lonely as a cloud. But he's also done a really good job of breaking up the rhymes with some really discordant ones. It's hard to go from cloud to hills, even though you're going next to crowd and daffodils. That's just such a sharp change in sound. It really forces you to slow down as you're speaking. So if you have a poem that it's really hard to read quickly, there's probably a reason for that. And if you are yourselves writing poetry and you're trying to go for a certain feeling, look at the way that words sound and how quickly somebody is able to articulate them. That's going to change how fast they can read. Okay, we are going to go ahead and stop here with our discussion of pacing.